and many of the key concepts have been introduced. And what I want to talk about is persistent versus resolved acute kidney injury, a concept being put forth by AKI that John Kellen went through, and talk to you and show you some new data that I think will alert you to some of the possibilities of the future. And so in this AKI, we really wanted to focus on a few key concepts, and John has shown you the first two bits, which is the definition of injury, some discussion about renal recovery, and I'm going to focus in the next 15 minutes on persistent acute kidney injury. Now, this staging system should look incredibly familiar to you because this is essentially the same as the KDIGO acute kidney injury. The key difference here I want to point out is that there is this gap between after 7 days after AKI and before CKD. And I think that one of the things that was so pivotal about the rifle criteria, which then became the KDIGO consensus criteria, is we had this that acute kidney injury either rapidly resolved or didn't. And as we actually looked at the data with a consensus definition, we began to realize that there are a significant subset of patients who don't fit either definition. And so we sought to put some context around this, and similar to what was done with rifle, we will need to do a significant amount of research to demonstrate that these are appropriate. But it certainly has the based on something which has been widely successful. Now, persistent acute kidney injury, the definition that we are proposing is essentially based on the 48-hour cutoff. And I will not read the slides to you. You're all perfectly capable of doing that. But the main issue is that at some point when you produce a guideline or a definition, you have to make a decision as to what you think the critical cutoff is. And you can't do the research unless you have a hard definition, which is not to say that if you recovered at 47 hours, it would be dramatically different than 49 hours. And that's, of course, not the point. The point here is that the preponderance of data suggests that the 48 hours is the appropriate cutoff. And I'll show you some of that so you can get an understanding of why we think this is a highly rational recommendation. And we also want to point out that for those patients who do not recover from acute kidney injury, this time and space of acute kidney disease, I think, has been well informed from the previous. This is the opportunity to intervene. As Ronaldo and Ravi just showed you, this is the opportunity to avoid the repeated insults that likely changes the trajectory of an appropriate recovery to potentially a maladaptive one. And this is essentially what this continuum looks like. Acute kidney injury is still within its definition of 7 days, and AKD then takes you up until this point. Now, of course, there are those subset of patients who have pre-existing CKD, but by leveraging the baseline creatinine that we know and using the similar type of staging, which is familiar, it allows us to use AKD in a very similar fashion as AKI for those patients with pre-existing CKD. So when you see the 90-day cutoff of CKD, recognize for those patients who have AKI on CKD, this would then be potentially progression or acceleration thereof. Now, what I want to show why we arrived at this conclusion of 48 hours. These are data by Sean Kellen's group. And what I want you to look at here is the risk of ESRD or death. And you can see here that at 1 to 3 days, this is essentially the component of time for whatever stage of AKI for duration. If you can limit yourself in time, if you can accelerate a recovery, it appears to alter your downstream trajectory. So if I gave you a drug and I actually changed your duration, and this would result in this improvement of progression or risk of death, but it's highly rational and reasonable to believe that would be the case. I think that's a hypothesis ought to be tested. And as you move out to 4 to 6 days, and then beyond 7 days, what you see is a stepwise increase, independent of stage. And of course, some of these patients can move in between them. This duration puts you at risk for worse outcome. These data are similarly shown by Chawla Parik's group, cardiac surgery. And what you see again is that here at this 1 to 2 days, as compared to no AKI, you see this stepwise diminishment of survival, progression to CKD as you go out to a longer duration. And I'm going to show you just 2 more slides to sort of put this into context. I will take you through the 15 references for where this is, but this is all diabetic veterans. And what you see here is that your AKI stage is important, but duration, as taken into account with this, actually drives the outcome much more dramatically. Now, I think it's obvious to everyone here who takes care of patients with acute kidney injury that there is a connection between severity and duration. For those patients who have stage kidney injury, obviously their course of recovery to be dramatically improved in a very short duration of time is much less likely. But they do interact with one another, and if you sort of really try and get into the numbers, a certain number of days of AKI stage 2 at some point is essentially the same equivalent risk as hitting stage 3. And so this kind of point scoring is useful for assessing risk, but I think this also suggests that if you can alter the duration, if you can alter this systemic or at least local effect in the kidney, that might actually alter the trajectory of recovery. Because what you've seen in the data and the mechanistic work is that the maladaptation is not maladaptive at all, in the sense that the cell has to make a decision. And if the decision is to die or to fibrose, fibrosis is probably safer for the host than cell death. And I think this is a highly rational decision at the cellular level as to what to do if you can't move on to full recovery. The thing that we can do, and I think we will start with the safest, easiest things of doing less harm, might be very easy approaches to test and actually alter outcomes and improve them. And this is lastly in a large critically ill patient population, and they similarly show that this transient timing of around 48 hours is important. Interestingly, they demonstrate that the stage and the duration in this group were slightly confounded insofar as you don't show this difference in transient versus persistence when you have stage into account. So realize that in certain subgroups, the clarity between transient and persistent may not be as clear, and we will have to continue to do more work with proposed definitions to make sure that they're reading out as the previous data have suggested. And so with this, I want to talk to you about something which we've recently done some work on, about this notion about creatinine variability. And some of this is going to be a little bit mathematically painful, so I hope you'll bear with me. This is a paper which is in press. And what we basically did is we attempted to look at this notion of creatinine variability. Now, if you look at a patient who has a highly stable creatinine over time, they of course have no creatinine variability. Their variability is essentially zero. Now, when you look at this patient, who presumably has chronic kidney disease, you would say their creatinine is stable over time, depending on what you mean by stable. So if I do a simple mathematical equation and do serum creatinine divided by 10, because it's going up, there's variability. So if you do a study and you're attempting to look at variability as a predictor of worse outcome, there is inherent mathematical coupling because patients with steeper slopes move more and they move their creatinine more over that time point. So you essentially prove that steeper slopes are worse for you. And I don't think anyone needed a sophisticated analysis to tell you that. So in order to do this, we decided to do something a little bit different. And the credit for this goes to our lead statistician, Richard Hamner. And what we did is we said that for every patient in the analysis, what we're going to do is go back into time and look at their peak monthly creatinine. And then based on this is an actual patient, we will then draw the slope, the regression curve through that slope. So now what you have is an individualized slope for the patient. And then what you do is you look at the residual distance from the point to this line, and this point to this line, this point to this line, and you take that difference and you square it. And that, when you look at that over time, gives you a sense of serum creatinine variability that is not affected by slope per se. And so this patient has low variability, whereas this patient has significantly higher variability. And this variability is not dependent on slope. This is slope independent. And so those of you who've seen Bruce Molitoris give this talk about sawtooth nature, which he's showing you from the VA data set, we similarly leverage the VA data set to look at serum creatinine variability, which we refer to as serum creatinine nonlinearity. Now, I apologize for the painful term. It's not nearly as cool as mitotic catastrophe, which is by far the best phrase I think I've heard all week. And if I was ever in a band and had any musical ability, I would definitely name my band Mitotic Catastrophe. But we were not so inspired, and we came up with serum creatinine nonlinearity. So what this basically means is the more of a sawtooth you have line, the higher your variability. The closer you are to your regression line, the less variability you have. This is critically important because the slope is not dictating the risk here. Now you're looking at variability per se. And what we found is really quite astonishing. The higher your variability, the worse your outcome. And you can see that the first two quartiles are nearly superimposed. But you hit a critical threshold when you go to quartile 3 and massively to 4. Now, what's very interesting is that this variability predicts outcome independent of your baseline eGFR. So this is not just heavily tainted towards patients who have CKD. And I'm going to show you this data in just a moment. But this is something which predicts independent of your serum creatinine slope and independent of all your classic and standardized risk factors. So what I want to show you now is basically this key data. Now, I want to orient you to this slide, so I'm going to take you through a few classifications of different GFR levels. So what you have here on the percentage of patients in these given groups, and on the x-axis is your serum creatinine variance. So what this basically means is that your variance on the far right is very high. Those are patients who have very sawtooth creatinines, and on the far left are those that are very flat and very close to their regression line. And within each bin, you see the proportion. And to orient you by color, a lot of black is bad, and blue is good, and gray is okay. And what you see is that even amongst patients who have a normal GFR by CKD-EPI, the GFR of greater than 90, if you have high variability, you have a much more rapid serum creatinine decline. So no matter what, now this, I'll show you the rest of this as we go through each eGFR group to show you how the spectrum changes. But this was simply an astonishing thing that we saw, that if you have a normal eGFR, but you have a lot of variability, nothing good is going to happen to you. Now, as you walk your way down, what you'll notice on the spectrum is that as your eGFR declines, more patients move into the far right bin. And this continues on as you get down to an eGFR of 75. And then once you drop below 60, what's very interesting is the far left becomes a much smaller proportion, and it's consistently to the right. And the basic readout here is as your eGFR goes down, your serum creatinine variability as a proportion of that population goes up. And this is something which is not completely surprising, but the fact that it has such a consistent trend line to it was surprising to us. And once you drop below 30, you can see here that the vast majority of the patients with rapid decline make up a lot of this group. So the readout from this is that this group of patients, there's very few of them. But even if you have a low eGFR, if your variability is low, you don't progress. So CKD in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean progression. You can have stable CKD. Not every single patient with CKD is destined to an inexorable decline in a dialysis patient. There are a significant number of patients with advanced CKD that don't progress. Interestingly, they have little creatinine variability. So the take-home message from this analysis, and I certainly understand that in a short period of time, walking you through this entire analysis is a bit challenging, is that increased serum creatinine variability is associated with progression to advanced stage CKD and death. And this is independent of all the standard risk factors. Interestingly, serum variability and your increased slope are interrelated, but they independently predict the outcome. So they're statistically independent, but not surprisingly, they're linked. And this observation, and I think this is the part that was so surprising to me, is independent of your baseline eGFR. Now, before we get into what this might mean, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about statistics. And I apologize for this, it just being just before lunch. Most of us in this room subscribe to this association as being causal. The more education you have, the more money you're likely to earn. Which is not to say we got into medicine for the money, because if you did, you made a big mistake. But in general, we subscribe to the notion that the more education you have, the more money you make. We believe this is a causal phenomenon. Here's another association, this is actually based on true data, which is ice cream sales and shark attacks are strongly associated. This is a fact. I tell my fellows the reason this tends to happen is because the sharks, when they're in warm water, prefer a colder meal because it's more enjoyable and likely they just have nice sweet thing. They taste better. And you'd be stunned how many of my fellows I can actually get to believe this nonsense. But of course, we know that this association is due to temperature as a confounding intermediating variable. When it's warmer, people eat more ice cream, and when it's warmer, they go into the water more, hence the risk of being bitten by a shark, particularly in Australia. I don't know if that's Renal. So this is something which we recognize to have a confounding intermediating variable. So when we think about serum creatinine variability, we acknowledge a priori that there are multiple explanations to this. And I want to walk you through just a few of the possibilities. So whenever you have an association and you really don't know if it's causal, we've taken the approach of saying, we don't know what this is. We know it's bad, it's consistently bad, and no matter what subgroup you look at it in, it predicts worse outcomes. So either increased serum creatinine variability causes the progression. It could also be that people who progress demonstrate more variability, right? So CKD, as an example, has more problems with water regulation than people who progress. Or there's an intermediating variable or problem that can occur. Let me show you some of the possibilities. So subclinical acute kidney injury would certainly be a reasonable hypothesis for increased serum creatinine variability. Others have shown beautifully that biomarker-driven subclinical AKI is linked to outcome. It could also be the case that a loss of autoregulation, and Claudio has demonstrated, and many others, that when you lose your renal reserve, you lose autoregulation, and a loss of autoregulation predisposes you to a volume event or some other intercurrent illness to create more injury. There's also the possibility that there's an intermediating event. Maybe your hypertensive medication prescribed, and you have high blood pressures and low blood pressures, and this results in variability. And I think that all three could exist in any given patient over any given time course. So I think that it's very important not to leap to what I thought I wanted this to be, which would be subclinical AKI, because it suits some of my a priori hypotheses. But I have to say that we should be a little more conservative and recognize that we don't know, and this requires more research to understand what is causing this. So we're proposing this notion as a vital sign. So you know the standard vital signs for your patients in the hospital, which is blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, pulse ox, and temperature. And when you go to a nephrology clinic, the things we carefully look at is your blood pressure, your heart rate, your level of proteinuria. Now, what's nice about serum creatinine variability is that it is free. This value can be derived from the previous creatinines for any of your patients. We're developing an app for the spreadsheet. I'll be happy to provide it for you. Just email me, and you just put the creatinines in, and it'll calculate the mean square root for you. And whether it is from subclinical AKI, whether it's from bad management, whether it's from loss of autoregulation, similar to the way you deal with a fever, we think you should think about serum creatinine variability. If you have a patient and they have a fever, it can be caused by any number of things. Most of them, it could be atelectasis, it could be an autoimmune disease, it could be cancer, it could be an infection. But if it's persistent, we are obliged to chase this down. And I similarly think that if you have a patient who has increased serum creatinine variability, you're obliged to try and understand what is causing this, because the fact that it exists portends a very poor ongoing prognosis for your patient. So in summary, transient AKI is associated with better outcomes than persistent. We look to validate these data. The available evidence suggests that the 48-hour cutoff is appropriate. Interestingly, is that increased serum creatinine variability is associated with CKD and death. In my view, this may represent a form of acute kidney disease. This is a hypothesis. This form of AKI and repeated injury could be a form of transient AKI in not just inpatients, but outpatients. So with that, I'll stop and I'm happy to take questions from the panel. Thank you.